Mm. Okay, they didn't come.
Folks are moving over from another meeting ID and should be dropping in shortly.
Okay. Dokie, this is great. Now we won't collide with that other Zoom meeting. It's always a little annoying because we want these recordings to be separate when they get uploaded. So if they start joining the meeting before we leave, then it just turns into one long continuous recording. That's the reason why we want to use this other Zoom link.
Did you update the information for the calendar already, or?
I did, yeah. But again, I feel like I did this last week. Maybe I updated the sampling one instead of the errors one because they're both supposed to be this. But
otherwise, it will happen again.
Yeah,
you will get after the call.
Yeah, I feel like we've tried to change it twice now, and for some reason it hasn't been sticking.
It looks good now, like all the upcoming events have 6729 on them.
Okay, so
Nice.
next week, if it seems to have reverted back, we'll know something's actually up. Okay. Thank you all. Putting up with the typical amount of open telemetry Muppet antics around all of this stuff. So let's see, July 16th. And we've got Nikita here, who's agreed to help champion the errors and exceptions issue and get it over the finish line. So thank you for that, Nikita.
Anytime.
Yeah, and I see you have the first item on the agenda.
Wait a couple of weeks and we were tired of me nagging you to finish that. Yeah, so to the point, Matt, will you finish that pull request today?
Yeah, I will. I saw this comment from Christian that he would like this split out into separate documents. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's sensible, but up to you. Do you want to make that in this pull request or in the follow-up? Whichever makes that pull request merged in reasonable amount of time.
I can do it either way. I mean, this pull request is mergeable as is. It doesn't require me to have to do anything else. This other one will have to require me to split this out into separate documents. I can do either one.
So doesn't matter for me if that pull request get merged by tomorrow. That will be awesome. Anyway, changed or not changed.
That's fine. I can do that. It's just I will update this PR and the document that everybody has been commenting on will not be there any longer. That's the only downside.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So
what
probably
if you just delete the API piece out of it and leave that as the semantic conventions, so that document's still there, and then create a new PR for the API one?
Yeah, that probably works. I could probably just move this document to be the semantic conventions and then add an additional, or just edit the span API for the API part, and stuff will probably still stay intact. I think that sounds like a good plan.
Perfect. Thank you.
Nice.
No problem.
Okay, so hopefully that puts a stake in exceptions, at least from the spec issue. Seems like we're over the finish line on that, which is great. Are there, just to clarify, is there further work on exceptions from the point of view of semantic conventions or anything else? Not the error flagging that we're going to get into, but I believe what Matt's done covers all our bases from the spec point of view. I just want to clarify, does anyone else think there's something else related to exceptions we need to focus on at this time besides implementing this?
Not for GA. This should be good enough for GA.
Great. Going once, going twice. Sold. So let's get on to this second bugbear then, span status and the removal of span status. So I've been watching this conversation kind of go by, but Nikita, do you think you could give like an overview of the discussion around span status?
So there was that pull request recently, which just got canceled, with aim to like expand span status. There was a discussion about the current span status, which is like copy paste of gRPC statuses, and we tried. People tried. I haven't participated yet. People tried to understand why these enumeration of statuses came by. So why Google introduced these list of statuses?
Yeah,
that haven't been answered yet by today by Google people. But then a couple of opinions started appearing that do we need that status at all? Because apparently we don't know for sure what the enumeration of statuses do we want there. So there was a proposal of removing that statuses, and several people chimed in that yes, that's a good idea. Nobody from the vendor clients ever needed that. So why do we have that? And so to start things moving, I have created that issue. So if we don't understand why do we need the status and current status says enumeration, it sometimes strange. So probably can just drop it and replace as a first step at least to just replace it with one Boolean flag, either semantic convention or field, error, true or false. That's it.
By the way, just for reference, the Jaeger exporter and the open tracing shim for Java, they use this one to mark errors. So there are minor use case, but yeah, we need to consider
They use this one. Which one?
Status.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, yeah, because they have this open tracing style of error Boolean thing to set it. It's not a major case, but still just for further reference. Probably can be easily replaced with a new error hint, or I don't know if we could have a direct mapping or not, but yeah, we just need to take this into consideration. Yep.
There is a related proposal to have a new semantic convention for the span severity based on the log severity enumeration. So that doesn't help Jaeger probably, but that can add some more like nuances into that. Where on the spectrum this span is.
But isn't that just for information if you're going to drop some events to drop the least important ones? I think that's the purpose for that.
Probably. I don't know yet.
Yeah. I think we want to have a log severity concept for events in particular. But maybe, so I think here's maybe a proposal of a slight reinterpretation of this span status code that might help. We do need something, but it's not something we need for describing the underlying operations. That's actually, in my opinion, why span status is kind of confusing, because you're trying to say, how does this status code map to a semantic convention for what this operation is doing? But I would like to propose that the status code is actually not part of describing the underlying system. The purpose of the status code is to tell the telemetry system to do something. You're telling the telemetry system that a span is like just an ordinary span, or you're saying this is an exceptional span in some way. And so the backend system should recognize it as exceptional, and the assumption should be that if you do that, the chance that it will be recorded goes up. That to me is the primary purpose of something like an error flag or a status code. You're telling the collection system at the time of instrumentation that this should trigger any form of like tail sampling or anything that you can do to capture an error trace, regardless of what your initial sampling settings.
But that is probably captured perfectly by the severity.
But the severity is for events, correct?
While there is a proposal to add severity to spans.
I see.
So
I see.
that may solve it. And the second part, that for at least that error Boolean flag can be used not only for decision record or not, but as a simple simple use case. What's my error rate? So just like a simple metric derived metric error rate.
Right.
It's much easier to base that on just error Boolean flag.
Makes a lot of sense. I see. So yes, severity would work better than a Boolean. There was feedback from Open Tracing that a Boolean was not quite enough. So yeah, something like that's a little more extensible than just a Boolean would make me feel comfortable. So maybe that's it. Maybe it's we just use severity. I think the reason why severity felt a little weird for me is people often request something like that so that they can drop spans out of a trace. They're like, we're generating too many spans, so we want to drop them, thinking like I drop my unimportant logs. But the thing about dropping spans other than logs is spans are structural, right?
Yeah.
So you're changing the shape of the graph, you're changing the context in which things occur, and it becomes super unclear what it means in some cases to be saying I'm going to drop some spans out of a trace but leave some other ones. So I think that's the only issue I would have with calling it log severity is we need to do something to make sure people understand it's not for dropping spans. It's for maybe choosing whether to record an entire trace or not. But it's actually you, as an end user, you should know you don't want partial traces. You want to be comparing apples to apples with your traces. So you either want the trace or you don't want the trace.
So, but your opinion is that a simple Boolean flag is not enough. We need more broader spectrum, but we don't need like prefixed. We don't need fixed enumeration of possible statuses. So severity or any other like integer-based scale is good. Is good.
Yes, I think something like that. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still just another form of status code, right? Like log severity, that's essentially a status code. We're just, the difference is like the current status code has some semantic meaning to it beyond just how bad is it, right? It's trying to describe what kind of operation is it. And that I think is the part of
the
it
problem
that people don't like. It's not the idea that we have an enum and a status code that matches. And so, yes, if we change it to something like a severity level, like that would probably just be better.
I have a question. I'm not super familiar with the spec, but is it true that log severity would only be appearing on these exceptional or error spans, or is there?
No. So if we add severity to spans as opposed to logs or events, then it should be, or I expect it to be on all spans. Well, it's optional attribute, so but you can add that to all spans, I think.
Yes, I think, how do I want to think about this? Does this, in a way, maybe this unifies things, right? In the sense of, it would be nice if we're going to be triggering, collection mechanisms. People do understand that with log severity, and if it was universal across different data types, maybe that would be helpful, right? So It would be less work on the end user, for example, like whether they change the span severity or not. If a span contains events that have a high severity, that can raise the severity of the span itself, right?
Yeah, but here
So-
is the trick as well. Should severity of events on span somehow influence severity of the span?
I would guess so, right?
But then it becomes complicated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm thinking
this
more, yeah, I would think about it less about like it influences the severity of the span. It's more like, what am I trying to trigger on? Am I trying, and there's a lot of ways someone would be like, if you see this, I want to collect it.
Yeah, so
So do we just have one way of saying like, hey, this event's special. I don't know about the span around me, but I'm the guy, like, there's another question of who's responsible for the overall span status code. And it's a lot easier as an individual writing your code to be like, well, I know this event is super bad.
Yeah, the trouble I've always had with the log severity is that, you know, every developer's got their own opinion, and it's
Yeah.
very hard to ride, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, and it
all
seems like
on the same page, where the current statuses are concrete, you know, concrete stuff that you're describing.
Yeah. And the
Are they-
debug span doesn't make any sense. That's the other thing I'd like to
Yeah.
point out. Like
Yeah,
if you
right.
set
So-
your span to debug, it's not clear what the hell that means.
And some of this, you know, as far as tail sampling, I mean, you could feed off of more than the span status. I mean, you could look at other attributes.
Yeah.
To
Well,
say,
that-
okay, right now we think this is
Yeah.
our problem, so let's look at this, and then we got that under control. Now we think this is our problem, so let's look at this.
Yeah. So again,
does
that sort
the-
of gets back to my original proposal is you could have a status code that was just more focused explicitly on collection. Like this span is ordinary or this span is like exceptional. And maybe there's other statuses, but it's not statuses of like, it's more, actually, I shouldn't even say it's that this span is exceptional. If we just change it to like, collect this span, perhaps.
But then you,
Whether or not it's an error though.
it's still useful to know whether it's an error, and overloading the log severity, I think kind of dilutes that a little bit.
Well, log severity has the notion of, I mean, if we have log severity, okay, then users can derive error true or false from that, judging on their rules, but that extra burden that we put on them, so that's not good.
Yeah.
You can always, you don't have to make the judgment call up front. You can always handle it in tail sampling, look at other attributes. Like, for example, if you're talking about HTTP, you can look at the HTTP set status. You could look at the duration, spans. You could look at the number of events. What attributes are in the events? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, and if you go that route, then you always got the option of changing.
Yes.
One problem here is that I'm always looking at the problem from the perspective of auto instrumentation guy. So my idea is always that end user should take our auto instrumentation agent, attach to his process, and get the meaningful result, which means, among other things, to get meaningful error rate metric. For that,
Yeah.
without them needing to configure where is my error threshold on the severity.
So even
Yeah,
with,
but that requires a judgment call by the library writer. I mean, everybody who
Yeah.
uses that library is going to get consistent
And-
results. But
and
what
from-
if I don't agree with it?
From auto instrumentation point of view, out of the box experience may be quite easy. We see exception, we put error true. And
Yeah.
you can configure whatever you
Yeah.
like if you don't like.
Yeah.
But for us, out of the box experience is important. Ideally, zero configuration.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that.
but I think
So
you
that's
could
what-
do this with log severity or any of these I think that maybe another way of putting what Kevin is saying is we do need to make sure there's a mechanism that we describe to people for doing this in the collector. The collector has a pipeline concept in it that includes a transformation step. And in that transformation step is where you would be, presumably setting it just like any other transformation you set right now. Like when you see this pattern, set the status code, to error, or set the log severity of this span to, 99.
That's second best. I mean, if you can just configure in the collector, that's second best. But still, why I advocate for simple Boolean flag is because that gives zero configuration.
Well, yes, but I just mean, like, just to describe what Kevin's doing. Let's say it's a Boolean flag where it's on or off. You can configure this in your backend system to like suppress errors or raise them. Different backend systems have different tools for doing that. But from an open telemetry, like the telemetry pipeline point of view, you could do it in the collector as well. So it's not an either or. I think we just need to make sure, we explain to people you can do it both ways. Because I do think I've worked with enough people who use the collector in this manner already. Like they're already leaning pretty heavily on transformations, not necessarily for errors, but for a lot of things. So it's not an unnatural place for operators in particular to want to, like, as an operator, you might want to just be squashing something. So you just redeploy a collector, at some junction in your telemetry pipeline to adjust the pipeline of data coming into your backend system. For example, it's expensive to take a span all the way to the backend and then decide that it's not interesting, right? So you want to have a way, if you can push that information forward into the telemetry pipeline and drop it as soon as possible, that can save you a lot of money. So
we cannot drop span.
Do that. Yeah. Well, no, I dropped the trace. I'm saying, like, if you've got a trace coming, it's like, you really should collect this trace, and you want to put a point in your pipeline, which is like, if you see a trace like that, like this one that says collect me, I actually am not interested in that span, that trace. So like, I don't want to trigger trace collection.
But you in general case, you don't see the whole trace until the backend. You have distributed trace.
Yeah.
And different nodes in that distributed trace can send that accidentally to different collectors. So you cannot drop traces on the collector unless you have single node system.
Or you're using sharding and sending all of
or you have some
spans for a trace to the same instance.
Yeah.
Or you're using Lightstep, but I forget that's a Lightstep-y thing that we do.
So so coming back, we have two questions I think here. First, do we want Boolean flag right on the span? Second, is it enough for us to have? Do we want to have severity on span or some extra thingy pertaining more? Do we want to collect that or not? So I would vote for yes, we want Boolean flag and we want just severity.
I would say that I'm definitely in favor of a Boolean flag to indicate like an error. I have some slight concerns with severity, although it probably could work. But there would have to be a mapping. There would have to be a mapping from severity to Boolean flag. That's
easy. Yeah. That's easy. Log severity already define error range. So if you have error range, it's error. That's it.
But yeah, and I think the other slight can of worms with log severity is last time I looked, we had 24 levels in OpenTelemetry, which is interesting and possibly confusing.
I was surprised by that.
But they have recommendations that for each level, if you don't need those nuances, you have to put this severity.
Yeah, it's
So we
actually
have
like
some-
it's like 4 levels, 4 or 5 levels, and then it's like if you're like, no, I need a little bit of wiggle room for this one
Yeah.
special case, they leave room for that because people regret it when they don't have that bit of space. When you're like, this one's actually a 3.5. But yeah, it looks confusing on the surface. What's going to be really confusing is what is the severity level that's lower than debug? Here's a question. In our current severity chart, what's lower than debug as the lowest possible severity you could set? Want to know what it's
Trace?
called? Trace. That's going to be really confusing. That's going to be really confusing.
So, where was I? Yeah. So I have that issue about adding Boolean flag.
Mhm.
So if you, I can make a separate issue if there is not one yet about adding severity to the span. I think they should be different issues, although they are connected, but we can't decide on them separately. They not depend upon each other, I think.
Yeah.
They can complement each other, but they don't depend. And
Yeah,
if
on
you have
the Boolean flag, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So the first thing somebody's going to ask is, can you separate out the, speaking in HTTP terms, the 400s from the 500s? What would you say to something, which was actually a topic on the metric channel this morning? What would you say to that?
So I think this was when at the spec sig, I identified that as like a third body of work, error suppression. And I think we're going to have to solve this either on the collector side, being able to identify a certain error on a certain operation and just say, ignore that. This is not important to me, actually. Or have a way to do this at the SDK level. But I think there's always going to be the situation where opinions are going to vary. And if we go back to kind of the auto instrumentation situation, like the auto instrumentation is going to see some sort of an exception, and it's going to probably flag it as error equals true. But depending on the application, the user might not consider that to be an error case. And I think that the thing that makes this so nuanced is that if something is an error, I think this means this is a thing that should count towards your error rate. Like somebody should get paged or woken up in the middle of the night when this starts happening. If that's not true, then you probably want to suppress this. You may want to record it because it's interesting, and it's something that you would like to be aware of. But I think this is a slightly separate topic, but probably can be solved on the back end or by adding some sort of like kind of per component like error filter or error handler, where you can have one last chance to get a handle on an error and say, you know what, ignore this one for me.
I have an issue from my vendor side, just built in a configuration to those exceptions from those operations. Doesn't matter. Don't raise an error flag or whatnot. So that's not an error. So it's probably we will. Well, I don't know if we need that in spec, but in the practical sense, in like NSDK or actual agent sites, we need some configuration knobs for users to tell this is important, this is not. But so yeah, please go to that at least Boolean flag issue or remove span issue, because I don't know. Is it okay issue as it is now replace status field with error Boolean field, or do we need to replace with, or can we drop status only after we have both Boolean flag and severity flag? So current issue proposes essentially replace status with Boolean flag. Is it okay? If not, please comment, and then we can look at them together.
I would support replacing it with a Boolean flag. I know Carlos brought up like the Jaeger exporters. All those that I've seen in the various languages interpret anything other than a status OK as error. So they basically collapse span.status into a Boolean flag, and the only one that's true, or the only one that would be error false, is an OK status.
Actually, I can see the use case for a debug trace, just not a debug span, for what it's worth.
You mean severity equal debug, or?
Yeah. For the thing that comes up when I think about that is health checks are a classic example of endpoints that people think are noise, and they're like, turn them off. And that's noise until it isn't, right? Until you have a problem with the health checking system and you want to look at it. So that to me would be an example of a debug trace. So if we wanted to have a concept of severity, maybe it's something along those lines. But again, that gets a little complicated unless you have the whole trace assembled to decide what was the highest severity you found in a span on the trace. But you could say like a trace where all the spans are debug, or like the severity level of the trace overall is the severity level of the highest severity of a span on a trace, if that makes sense. It's still more complicated than just a Boolean though.
Yeah, so that's why, although I see the profit from both, I propose to look at them separately, so we can have error in spec as soon as possible, and then we can discuss severity, because that's complicated, much more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we would eventually potentially just like deprecate the Boolean potentially. Like if we decided eventually log severity was enough, I'm just trying to think ahead. It would be feasible to eventually be like, oh, we found a more nuanced system. Now we don't need this Boolean anymore. And so you have to set one or the other, but the Boolean is deprecated. You no longer need to set it if you're setting this other thing. So that would be a way to start with a Boolean now. Simple is good enough, but we're just making sure we're not like painting ourselves into a corner. It would be reasonable to add something like severity later and say, okay, we have a more nuanced thing. The simple thing is deprecated. So it still works. You can still set this, but if you don't set it and you set the other thing, then that's fine. So we'd have a path forward. That actually makes me really confident about going with a Boolean personally. Because I do think there's value in investigating this log severity and potentially, or severity level, in applying that. I like clean designs. I like it when we reuse concepts across different components in OpenTelemetry because we have so much surface area. I still regret we didn't call everything tags, but whatever. It would be helpful to have a more universal concept like log severity that we could apply to metrics, and even if you want to think about it that way.
One last thing about error equals true. Should that be like a field on the span, or is just an attribute?
I think it should be a field, because this isn't a semantic description of the underlying system, right? In the sense of what we're saying is this is part of the telemetry collection system. This is not part of describing your underlying thing.
Okay.
If you want to hammer that in for people, And I suspect that may help with parsing on the back end because you only have to parse the protobuf. You don't have to get into looking at the digging through. You don't necessarily have to dig through all of the attributes to get at this thing.
Okay. So
Yeah,
please
I
go
agree
to
with that
GitHub
approach.
and comment and put pluses and say yes, and then we can actually do it.
If it's a field, what does that mean for the backwards compatibility of the proto? Like, is it going to be required?
Well, yeah, the current proto field, right, for OTLP has status code. So if we change this, if we remove status code, then it would be a breaking change for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a separate question. I have no idea. Can we do that breaking changes, or should we just mark it as deprecated and error? So please tell that. So please tell me.
I think we need to ask Tigran, but initially I could be, I mean, so if you ask me, I feel that marking the tracing part as stable was probably like something we should have, done later on. And we are before 1.0. I wouldn't especially like having a deprecated field before 1.0. So I know it's painful to break this, but my vote would be for removing it and break it.
Yeah.
But let's ask Tigran and other people who are stakeholders.
The reality is that the collector and this, well, but maybe not with this data protocol, but the collector is certainly much farther into production than the rest of OpenTelemetry. I think that's where the concern might be, just for clarity. So OpenTelemetry is definitely not at 1.0 yet, but the collector is actually pretty well adopted in production in a lot of places.
Okay.
So that's why it's some nuance.
So let's ask Tigran.
But there's also no issue at all at just having a deprecated field on a proto and then you remove it from the API. That's just totally normal. So it's not a big deal.
Well, actually, yeah, I could be fine, honestly, as long as we remove it in that case from the API before 1.0.
Yes, that would be my proposal. We would leave it. You can mark things in proto as a deprecated field, I'm pretty sure. So it's obvious that it's deprecated to someone using the data format. And then you just don't have that in the API anymore. You replace it with this Boolean and then it's clean. And that would probably be at this stage, I would guess, maybe a better approach than breaking the protobuf. Though if other breaking changes are going to happen to that protobuf, we, I guess, would when I say, if you're going to break it, please remove the deprecated fields while you're at it. So, yeah. Okay, this feels good to me. Is there anyone that this does not feel good for? We're hearing a lot of positivity. Is there anyone on the call with reservations about going towards starting with this Boolean and then investigating severity as a longer term concept?
Sorry, I just have one more question about the breaking change, which is the status thing makes sense, but for adding the new Boolean, how can that happen in a way that's not breaking? Because it'll default to false, right? If it's not required in the proto. And then we'll expect people to keep converting using the status code if they want to extract a Boolean. I guess my question then is, how do you distinguish between the old proto case and the error was actually false case?
You presumably the old systems would still be setting the status code, and so you would have a conversion step, maybe in the collector or somewhere else, right? So somewhere down your pipeline, you would have a more updated component that would map it, or your backend could just be if status code is still being set, I'm still going to respect it. Just the same way you would respect the Boolean flag after you move to a new status like log severity. So it's more like
that.
If one of these
means
set, then I look at that. Yeah.
But Boolean will be always set, either false or true.
Right. Well, I should say if Booleans, if someone's using the old system, then then status code is going to be something other than okay, right? So you can say if this is something other than okay, that's also set this error Boolean, or this counts the same as the error Boolean being true. If people have moved past their deprecated system and they're updated, then span status will always be set as okay, because that's the default, I believe, or it will be set to null or something like that. So you will always be able to tell, right? Unless you.
But we will have to specify those like rules in somewhere.
Yeah, you'd have to say, like, if any one of these is set, then it counts as an error, might be the correct way of interpreting it. I agree, it's a thing to note, though, we have to actually give advice to people about how to handle this deprecated stuff.
Yeah, if span status is okay and error is false. Oh, I guess those are consistent, so it's fine. Okay, yeah.
Then,
cool.
then you're all fine. And
Okay.
if the span's okay, but the error is true, then you're like, okay, then this is
It's error.
yeah.
Well, that status is a separate structure. So if they quit using it, it'll just be null or nil or whatever. So
It might be
if
even
it's
easier.
that, and then go look at the flag if it's not, and they're still using that. So
Okay, cool, thanks.
do it.
Good.
Oh, Ted, you're so good. You're writing notes.
I want to make sure we have, this is the part we always forget, right? Yeah, if people would like to check these notes before we got a little bit of time left, maybe we can spend the last bit of time here cleaning up these notes to make sure they actually reflect accurately what the group believes.
I like it. So it's,
Yeah.
I like it. So I probably will copy paste almost, well, reflect somehow these meeting notes in the GitHub issue, just so that all the knowledge is in one place. And then I hope proceeding with actual changes as well. That will be my first spec issue, so probably will take time.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, people. Sorry.
Okay, those are my notes. If people are satisfied with this, then I would declare this working session a success. And we can break unless there's any other last minute topic or questions people want to discuss. And everyone's clear about next steps?
Sorry, okay, I have one more question. Matt, your errors PR that we were gonna merge, that first one, did you need any more or want any more approvals on that from non-Lightstep folks, or is that good to go?
Let's see what its approval status is looking like. There was a request to restructure the content. So that's the thing that has to
It
happen.
needs to be reapproved. Okay, cool.
It could use some approvals from some other non-Lightsteppers. Right now, Christian from Dynatrace has approved it, but all the other approvers are from Lightstep. The ones who have approval, who are approvers on the specification. There's a lot of non-approvers who have approved it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. People who don't have the official approval status, which maybe we should be expanding. I think we're behind the curve on, I don't want to say promoting people because Jesus, but I think we are behind the curve on honoring the commitments that people have made so far to the project and reflecting that with community membership and approval levels. So maybe we need to do a round as maintainers of reviewing the roles and seeing if there are more people who are contributing currently who could be added to these concepts. Certainly the error working group should contain some people who don't work at Lightstep who can like approve things in the spec, right? That's a little rough. If like who on this call has approval status in the spec who is not a Lightstepper? Nobody. So that's actually a thing.
Yeah. Bottleneck.
I feel like this is a TC and maintainer issue. It should be brought up again at the Monday meeting. Just FYI, I'm going to be out Friday and Monday, so I won't be at the Monday maintainers meeting. But
Okay, just to be clear, this is about the approvals, right?
Yeah, just about approvers. So Carlos, you're on the technical committee. Can you take the action item to bring this up at the maintainers meeting on Monday?
Yeah, definitely.
And since the TC are the, you know, the maintainers of the spec, seeing if you can expand the roles, since we now have this working group around errors, it would be great. You know, I would certainly sponsor Kevin and Nikita, as I've seen their work personally. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, sure, definitely. I will take.
No offense to anyone else on the call. I just don't know you. Sorry.
Yeah, for a start, I think Kevin and Nikita sound like a good option. We can iterate later on as we go.
I wouldn't give me an approval on spec yet. I'm not even sure I have read it all. So on the relevant part.
Yeah. Well, one thing we've been trying to do is give like approval status to some subsections of the spec to allow us to have like actually a lot of spec approvers with domain specific knowledge, but not this feeling like anything can get okayed because there's just so many approvers. It's just too easy to get okay. And we now need to have like 8 approvals to pass something. So for the spec, maybe again with this, it's like just adding people to the tracing portion of the spec, essentially, because that's what we're talking about.
So up to TC, yeah.
But Carlos, you're going to take that back to Bogdan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I will prepare that.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. Good. Yeah, that was a good section.
Yeah.
Session.
Cheers.
And we are even on time.
I know. So pro. All right. Have fun, y'all.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.